Hello, World History. This is the 580T World History Midterm Review video, and it's got a lot of information that is going to help you a great deal with this midterm. And I'm going to go through, discuss all of these various questions, add a little bit to kind of help you grasp everything so that you don't have to just kind of memorize this by rote and then try to regurgitate that on the exam. You'll have some fill in to kind of help you with that. And so the first question is Unit 1, Early Civilizations, about 8000 BC to 500 BC. What were the four river valley civilizations? So that's going all the way back, right? Remember that they were Mesopotamia, Nile River Valley, that was in ancient Egypt, the Indus River Valley, and the Yellow River Valley in China. We'll see a map of these in a minute. And don't forget that Mesopotamia had numerous civilizations and empires throughout its long history. That brings us to this next question right here. Who were the Sumerians? Sumerians refers to Mesopotamians who lived before there were any empires in Mesopotamia. Sumeria was a hodgepodge of independent city-states. Remember those? So Sumerians were early pre-empire Mesopotamians. How can we describe the writing system of these early residents of Mesopotamia? You probably remember that. Even though the Sumerians didn't form empires, they did have a civilization. And they already had writing, and we call the writing system they had cuneiform. A little bit of detail to help you remember that. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped in Greek. The Sumerians didn't speak Greek, but we like to use Greek words to describe them anyway. And this is a good description of what cuneiform is because the Sumerians used a wedge-shaped writing utensil to carve wedge-shaped characters into clay tablets. Mesopotamia has a lot of clay, and clay tablets dry after you write on them, and then you have a permanent record that lasts thousands of years, and that's how we know so much about these people. So what was unique about the Nile River Valley's government? Well, we want to know what a theocracy is. That's the key word, theocracy. It's one of several types of governments that we've studied this semester, such as monarchy, republic, democracy, oligarchy. And a theocracy is a government in which the religious leaders are in charge. They run the government. Of the four River Valley civilizations, one had such a government, and that was the Nile River Valley in ancient Egypt. You'll probably remember this. The monarch, known as the pharaoh, was considered a god king, and all of his holy priests and scribes were government officials. So why, if you look at this map, would an early civilization want to live in one of these four darkened areas? What do all four offer? So we've got these four darkened areas right here. Nile River Valley, Tigris and Euphrates, Indus River, the Huanghe River or Yellow River. Why would a civilization want to be there? And so they're all river valleys. The Nile, the Indus, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Yellow. What do these rivers provide? They provide fresh water, and that's what you need to have an abundance if you want to grow crops. So that's all we really needed for Unit 1. Unit 2, the Eastern Classical Civilizations, about 500 BC to about 500, 600 AD. And we learned about three classical civilizations. The Zhou, the Qin, and the Han dynasties of classical China. The Maurya and Gupta dynasties of classical India. And lastly, the vast Persian Empire. And how can we summarize the accomplishments of classical India's great Gupta dynasty? So that's the one that looms large on this midterm. One of the things that we talked about with regard to the Gupta dynasty was that the Gupta dynasty oversaw a cultural golden age in classical India. And this golden age included advances in math, science, art, and literature. Much of the art and literature was inspired by a major Hindu religious revival. Remember that we studied Hinduism. It was of all the modern religions today, the world's oldest. In fact, it's so old we don't even know who founded it. And it had the caste system, and it believed in reincarnation. You remember those details? In what way can we give credit to the Gupta dynasty for this Hindu golden age? The Gupta dynasty had a strong and stable government that provided enough prosperity and security for all of this Hindu culture and knowledge to flourish. And that's a big theme in our course. When a civilization is able to enjoy periods of peace and prosperity and security, advances in math, science, art, and literature follow. People aren't having to dedicate their lives to just surviving. Good government facilitates more culture and knowledge for more people. Bad government facilitates those things for fewer people. Western classical civilizations. This brings us to Unit 3. Those two Western classical civilizations that we studied were classical Greece and classical Rome. So the first question is, how did the geography of Greece impact its political composition? You'll probably remember this. Greece, because of its rocky, craggy, mountainous geography, had lots of independent city-states, much like we just talked about with the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. Because city-states, because of this, different city-states in Greece had the ability to experiment with different forms of government. And you may remember the most prominent and powerful city-states that we studied in Greece were Athens and Sparta. They were very different from each other politically and culturally. We credit Athens with giving the world democracy, rule by the people. Under democracy, citizens get to decide what the policies will be and who runs things. But we also saw that not many people got to participate in Athenian democracy. Women didn't, foreigners didn't, slaves didn't. That's why democracy is such an important concept in our course. The more democracy you have in a society, the more people get to have a voice and a say in how that society's wealth and resources are distributed among the people. Not only in terms of money, privileges, and benefits, but also in terms of individual rights, freedoms, equality, justice, and access to things like education, healthcare, and opportunity. The less democracy you have in a society, the fewer people will get to enjoy all of those good things. And everyone else gets to live off the crumbs that fall from the tables of those lucky, privileged few. That's why we talk so much about democracy in this course. More democracy means more happiness for more people. Less democracy means more happiness too, but for fewer people. There are people in our society today who are fighting every day for more democracy. And there are also people in our society today who are fighting just as hard for less democracy. Less democracy for you, that is, not for them. Where do you stand on this question? Is in your future, will you fight for more democracy for more people? Or will you believe that democracy is only for some and not for others? There were lots of ways in which the powerful city-states of Athens and Sparta were the same. Both had slavery. Both had polytheism. Both were societies in which lots of people had no say in the government. But at least Athens had a democracy which allowed free Athenian male citizens to vote and to be leaders, whether they were rich or poor. Sparta didn't even have that. Sparta was what we call, and this is the key word, this is what you'll put right here, was an oligarchy. And an oligarchy is a government in which the power was held by a small, highly exclusive group of wealthy, powerful individuals. So I think that's enough information to fill out this table right here. No problem. So that brings us to Unit 4, the medieval world. And the first question is, what two institutions filled the political, economic, and cultural void left behind by the fall of Rome, the Roman Empire, in the West? Well, keep in mind that, Rome, the Roman Empire, this classical Western civilization, eventually fell and left behind a huge hole in Western Europe that would be filled by two up and coming institutions that went hand in hand: the church over here and feudalism. This next question is, describe the Great Schism of 1054. So that we got to do that before we talk about the church or feudalism. What can we say about the church? Don't forget that the eastern half of the Roman Empire survived the fall of the western half and went on to exist to the end of the Middle Ages. Today, we call that surviving eastern half the Byzantine Empire. They were a Christian empire, like the West was still Christian, thanks to the church. But the East and the West became so different from each other over time that it's no surprise that the Christian church split between East and West. And we call this split the Great Schism of 1054. It wasn't the only schism, but it was the great one. The western side became the Roman Catholic Church, and the eastern half became the Eastern Orthodox Church. And we talked about some of the disagreements that led to the Great Schism of 1054, such as disagreements over the use of objects in worship called icons, and arguments over leadership. Next, fill out this pyramid on feudalism, social pyramid. I'm going to put S for social pyramid. This brings us to the other institution that emerged out of the void left behind by the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, and that was feudalism and its economic counterpart, manorialism. Feudalism and manorialism are really just two sides of the same coin. A feudal society is what we would expect to find when there's very little money, very little infrastructure, very few towns and cities, and everybody farms, which was how Europe was for centuries after Rome fell. In this European society, the main currency was not cash. There was very little cash around. Instead, the main currency was land. And the society is a pyramid like this one. The king is at the top, and he parcels out land to the lords below him in exchange for oaths of allegiance and military service. Those lords, in turn, parcel out some of the land that they get to the knights below them in this third line, and that's also in exchange for oaths of allegiance and military service. And that piece of land and everything and everyone on it is called a manor. At the bottom of the society, you have the peasant serfs, and they live on the manor, and they work its land, and they serve the lord or knight above them in exchange for protection. And they were not allowed to leave the manor ever. So much for feudalism in Europe. What about Islam? How can we describe the founder of Islam? So another institution that emerged over in the East while Europe was going through these Middle Ages was a religion called Islam. People who believe in Islam were called Muslims. We talked a lot about the life of its founder, Muhammad, and his teachings. We talked about its beliefs and its accomplishments and its very long history and its various dynasties and empires. So Muhammad was the founder of Islam. What is the central belief of Islam? Its most central belief is that there is only one God. And we call this belief monotheism as opposed to polytheism. Islam is ultra monotheistic. Jews consider their religion to be monotheistic. They believe in only one God. Christians also consider their religion to be monotheistic. They also only believe in one God. But Islam is the most monotheistic of the three. So what is monotheism? I think we just defined it. That's what monotheism is. It's the belief in one God. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are all monotheistic religions. So hopefully that's a little clear. Now, label the following places in the spread of Islam on the map below. So you've got the Mediterranean, you've got Spain, there's Italy, here's Greece. This area is called Anatolia, or we call it also Asia Minor. This peninsula right here is Arabia. This whole thing, this big thing right here, is the top of Africa. So it's northern Africa. So soon after the death of Muhammad, the Muslim community regrouped, found a new leader, got Muhammad's teachings written down, consolidated the territorial gains they had made in over here in Arabia where it started, and started to spread their faith like wildfire. And in an astonishingly short amount of time, not just Arabia, but also Africa, Persia over here, and Spain were all under one Islamic empire. So the next question is, what were events that contributed to the slow decline and end of the Middle Ages? Well, these would have been things that, of course, weakened those institutions that marked the Middle Ages, and we already named them feudalism with its economic counterpart, manorialism, and, of course, the church. Remember the social pyramid that we just filled out: kings, lords, knights, and peasant serfs. We talked in Unit 4 about how the 100 Years' War saw the development of new war technologies like the longbow and artillery that undermined the exclusive power that lords and knights had on the battlefield. So you could put the 100 Years' War as one of those things, right? We also talked about the Great Papal Schism that lasted from 1378 to 1417. So it's not the same schism as the one we just talked about from 1054. In this schism, there were 2 competing popes in the West, and then 3 competing popes. And if the church can't work out its own problems better than that, then how can we trust the church to help us with our problems? So there's the Great Papal Schism. So you got your 100 Years' War, Great Papal Schism. And then finally you had the Black Death, which killed at a minimum a third of Europe in just 4 years. Our lords, who are above us, are supposed to protect us, and they couldn't protect us from the plague. The church, which is supposed to be able to appeal to God on our behalf, couldn't seem to pray the Black Death away. Both these institutions were useless. And not only that, but there was also a severe labor shortage now that so many people were dead. And if I'm a peasant serf, you can't keep me on this manor anymore working for you for free 2 to 3 days a week. You don't have the manpower to bring me back. I'm leaving because my labor is worth more now than you're paying. Somebody out there in the wider world will pay me more because there were fewer people around to do the work. So I can make a much better living somewhere else, and that is going to undermine feudalism. Let's not skip this question right here. This might be a good one. Now, this is a thinking question, too. Which of these 3 reasons do you think was the most important, and why? Which event does a double whammy on both the feudal system and the church? I would say that's the Black Death, although the others are pretty important. Not to mention the Crusades. Crusades isn't really mentioned on our midterm. Interactions and diffusions, about 600 to about 1450. Label this map with the following terms: Silk Road, Indian Ocean Trade Network, Gold Salt Trade Network, West Africa, East Africa, Europe, India, China, and the Sahara Desert. Ignore the boxes. So which set of lines represents which of these 3 trade routes? For example, what continent did the Silk Road traverse? Well, here's the Silk Road in red right here. What continent did the Gold Salt route traverse? And you can see the Gold Salt route right here, and it obviously traverses Africa, North Africa. And then finally, you have this Indian Ocean trade network, and that seems to incorporate both Asia and Africa. So, what kinds of goods traveled along these routes? Well, for the Silk Road, it was luxury items from China to Europe, especially silk, of course. For the gold salt trade route, once again, the name speaks for itself. Gold and salt, many other things also traveled along this route too, of course. West African gold mines over here in West Africa were world famous, and they produced numerous wealthy, advanced African kingdoms. It wasn't just goods and commodities, though. Ideas traveled and cultures diffused. And these ideas were not spread by armies and conquerors, but spread instead by merchants and missionaries who traveled along these trade routes. For example, Buddhism spread along the Silk Road, and Islam spread south across the Sahara Desert all the way to West Africa. Another cargo that was going to play a big role in the future of world history was traded by Arab merchants who traded along Africa's east coast on the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and that was slaves. Europeans are going to take up this practice almost the second they find a way south of the Sahara by sea, and you can kind of just see that along this green line. So I think that helps you fill out this chart right here. I think we answered all of that. So this next question is this. According to the map below, what did Europeans have to do if they wanted to trade with the Indian Ocean Trade Network? Well, where did the Europeans have to go if they wanted goods from the vast Indian Ocean Trade Network down here? Here's Europe up here. You can see Greece and Italy, right? If you look at the map, Europe is in the northwest corner, and the Indian Ocean is on the southeast corner. What lies between is the Islamic merchants and traders who will, of course, jack up the prices of all the goods that go through their territory. That's how middlemen make their money. They buy low and they sell high. And that's bad news for Europeans who have to pay high prices for anything coming out of the Indian Ocean Trade Network. So keep that in mind. That's going to be a big factor in our history. So Unit 6, Connecting Hemispheres, the Ottoman, Mughal, and Ming. Again, 600 through 1450. We haven't really left the Middle Ages yet. Who were the Janissaries and how were they recruited? Remember that the Janissaries were initially the elite slave army of the Ottoman Empire. To fill this army, the Ottomans required children from their non-Muslim peasant subjects. The Ottoman Empire was vast, and even though it was an Islamic empire, many non-Muslims lived within its territory and were subjects of that empire. And recruiting children in this way was a form of peasant taxation. The children were raised as Muslims and trained to fight as slave soldiers. It sounds like a pretty bad deal for these kids, but you probably had better food, and even though you were a slave, you could be richly rewarded for valuable service. And then we've got this Mughal Empire. Describe the Mughal Empire. Here are the basics about the Mughal Empire. It was founded in India. It was very large. It was an Islamic empire in a largely Hindu area. It ruled from 1521 to 1857. So that's actually kind of late, beyond this period that we're talking about. That puts it actually after the Middle Ages if you use European history as your standard. Like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal had many non-Muslim subjects living under their rule. And here is the interesting thing. This Islamic empire did not oppress people of other religions, not even the Hindu religion, a polytheistic religion. Instead, they treated others as equals, and that is a very unusual thing for an Islamic empire. Next question. Oh yeah, the Ming is a big subject on this midterm. It says, describe the Ming dynasty's so-called treasure voyages. A little background first. The Ming Dynasty took over China after almost 100 years of Mongol rule. And we talked about how the previous dynasty, the Yuan, wasn't actually Chinese. The Ming Dynasty brought China to new heights of economic expansion, cultural expansion, population expansion. One of the many achievements that the Ming Dynasty is known for are the 7 treasure voyages that were made between 1405 and 1433, commanded by the Chinese Admiral Zheng Ha. His treasure fleet had 28,000 sailors. They were a way for China to project China's image as an economic power all over the Indian Ocean trade network. So that's the treasure voyages. Describe the Ming Dynasty's treasure ships. These ships were massive, a feat of engineering and shipbuilding. They were made of wood, but they were twice as long as any ship known to exist at the time, carrying literally hundreds of sailors each. So what places did Zheng Ha's treasure fleets visit? We can see Zheng Ha's voyages on this map of the Indian Ocean trade network. Zheng Ha took these treasure ships all over it. And you can see all over the coast of China, into Southeast Asia, across India, right here, into the Persian Gulf, into the Red Sea, and along the trade cities of East Africa. So he was all over this network. So the question is, why did the Ming Dynasty eventually shut down these treasure voyages? Well, there were several reasons, and one was they hadn't gotten over the fact that the Mongols had once conquered and ruled them. And that fact still loomed large in their priorities. They wanted to put more resources into their own protection. And indeed, they did receive regular attacks from outside invaders. Another reason was that the Chinese considered themselves to be at the center of all things. They didn't need to go peddling their wares all over the Indian Ocean trade network, and they didn't need anything that foreigners had to offer. They had everything they needed right where they were. So the next question is, why did the Ming Dynasty only accept silver in exchange for their manufactured goods? Now, we've already said a lot about the Ming Dynasty's economic success. Their manufactured goods were sought after by the entire world. They don't need anyone else's goods. Their economy is huge. And the one thing they don't have enough of is cash, coins, currency. And in order to fill that need, they need silver to make coins with. Cash is the grease that helps economies run. And that's why the only thing the Ming Dynasty was interested in exchange for their manufactured goods was silver. And that brings us to our last unit, actually, Unit 7, Expansion, 1450 to 1750. I guess we're getting close to the end here. So the next question is, which was the first Mesoamerican civilization to build pyramids? Now, we've talked about the Maya and the Aztecs and the Incas, but none of these 3 civilizations were the first to build pyramids. Before any of them was a people called the Olmec, and they carved huge heads of stone as monuments. And they built the first pyramids, and they influenced the Maya and the Aztec to build pyramids as well. Next question is kind of a logical one. Which Mesoamerican civilization excelled at building pyramids? And that would be the Maya. They built lots of pyramids, and they also knew how to make smaller pyramids into bigger pyramids as the demand for greater size and height increased. So what were 3 Mayan advances in mathematics? They could measure the movements of heavenly objects. They made a 365-day calendar based upon their astronomical observations, with the naked eye, by the way. They did not have telescopes. And finally, they also knew how to do mathematical calculations using the number 0. What were 3 reasons for European exploration aside from the 3 G's that we already know about: God, glory, and gold? The reasons changed in importance over time. One reason was to find a way around the Ottomans, and we already talked about that. They were the middlemen who were jacking up the prices for everything that comes to them from the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Europeans knew that Asia was a source of great wealth, especially in spices. And we talked about in class why spices were so critically important. So Europeans explored in numerous directions to try to find a direct way to Asia that would bypass any middlemen that they would have to deal with. Europeans also had the advantage of advanced navigation technology, advanced ships, and advanced weapons. They had gotten the astrolabe from the Islamic lands and the magnetic compass from China. They had developed also a small but very seaworthy ships called caravels, which had state-of-the-art design features. And they could also defend themselves with weapons like cannons and muskets. Finally, as Europe's economy became better at manufacturing, there was a need for both raw materials such as lumber, cotton, furs, and sugar to be used in making finished manufactured products, as well as the need to find places where they could sell these finished manufactured products for good money. What was the impact of European discovery, conquest, and settlement on Europe? Well, the impact of all this was a new type of revolution. We call it the consumer revolution. There was an entire Atlantic economy built on the extraction and harvesting of commodities from the colonies, the shipping of those commodities to Europe, the converting of those materials into all kinds of manufactured luxury items, everything from fancy clothes to accessories to fancy cutlery to books to luxury foods and drinks like coffee and tea and an endless variety of things that you could buy, all made more available and more affordable by the cruelty and exploitation of slavery. It was unpaid, forced slave labor that harvested and extracted those raw materials: the cotton, the sugar, the coffee, the rum, the wood, the leather, etc., so that people who had very little idea how much suffering was being inflicted for their comfort could enjoy this life of ease and abundance. So, what was the main reason that the Spanish were able to easily defeat the Aztecs and conquer Mexico? When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés went to war with the Aztecs, he had several advantages. He did, in fact, have a modest amount of advanced weapons. He was also able to find friends among the Aztecs' many enemies. But the most important reason was what we talked about with regard to the Columbian Exchange. All of the diseases that Europeans brought with them that the Aztecs and many other native people had no resistance to. Smallpox and measles and cholera killed Aztecs by the thousands, and that brought their entire civilization to its knees. And this leads us to our next question right here. Why did European settlers establish the Atlantic slave trade and bring Africans to the colonies in such large numbers? Originally, the plan was to enslave Native Americans to do the work of harvesting, say, sugar. But as we just saw, these Native Americans started dying from all these diseases. And the Native Americans who had died needed to be replaced. And Africans already had the same exposure and therefore the same resistance to these diseases that Europeans had. So what economic system emerged from the slave trade to dominate the cultivation of such raw products as sugar, cotton, tobacco, and many other products? You're familiar with it, the plantation system. The Portuguese had slaves working on sugar plantations in their islands in the Atlantic even before America was discovered. And they simply moved the plantation system to their sugar producing colony in Brazil. There were, uh, from there, the plantation system spread to the Caribbean islands and finally to North America with tobacco plantations and cotton plantations. So the next question, describe the Columbian Exchange. We were just doing that, weren't we? This is very recent. What kinds of things got exchanged? Well, tons of different plants and foods, such as the potato, and fruits, and grains, and vegetables. Foods from the New World transformed the diets of people in the Old World, and vice versa. And this was a large part of that commercial revolution that we just talked about, with all of the influx of foods that were not native to the Old World. Lots of different animals like horses and cows and pigs got exchanged. People like slaves and settlers were exchanged. Ideas like Christianity and all the languages that we speak got exchanged. And finally, diseases, the diseases that killed so many Native Americans. So when this question comes along here, describe the commercial revolution, well, I think we just did. And much of it was driven by colonies, by slavery, and by the Columbian Exchange, like we talked about. Explain the concept of mercantilism. That's really not that important for the exam, but let's just touch on it. We've touched upon mercantilism a little bit because it's the economic side of the commercial revolution. Mercantilism says that if you want your country to be richer, you have to make other countries poorer. And it says that having lots of gold and other currency in your country gives your country power and security because warfare costs money and you have money. The best way to increase the amount of gold in your country is to import cheap stuff, make it into expensive stuff, and export it for more money. Colonies are essential for this because colonies is where you get those cheap raw materials that you can turn around, and then you can make your colonies pay top dollar for your expensive manufactured stuff. And that is just the basics of what we call mercantilism. But the real answer to the question of what did this commercial revolution really lead to was an economic system that we call capitalism. So we got this question right here. Explain the concept of capitalism. We also call this free enterprise or free market economics. In a capitalist system, such as the one we have here in the United States, people are free to choose what kinds of jobs they want to do in life and what they want to produce and what they want to buy. People are free to own their own property and own their own businesses and do what they like with those things as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. And they are free to make a profit from their work and their business. And the idea is, if everyone is free to do these things, then everyone benefits because the economy is more efficient because it's not bogged down by a bunch of repressive rules and restrictions. We often call this system capitalism. What is capital? Capital is a term meaning money that's used to fund a business enterprise. You can use your own money as capital, but the size of your business and how much it can do and how much profit it can make is going to be limited by how much money you have. And you don't have that much money all by yourself. But what if you can use someone else's money as well? How much more could your business do? How much more profit could you make if someone else was willing to add their money to your money and give you more capital to work with? Where do you go for this money? A bank? A rich person? That's why we call it capitalism, because you can always make your business bigger and more profitable if you have access to capital that is not your own. The TV show Shark Tank is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. If you've ever watched the show, in Shark Tank, people with a money-making idea go to these three rich people that are sitting there in their chairs, and they ask to use their money as capital to make their ideas happen. If the sharks think this idea can make a profit, they offer their money. But their money isn't free. They always want something in return. And usually what they want in return is part ownership in that business. That's capitalism. It requires freedom so that anyone with a profitable idea has the ability and the access to capital to act on that idea. Capitalism is not a perfect system. It is vulnerable to greed, abuse, exploitation, and corruption. And we need a responsible government which is willing to step in when necessary and protect people from these abuses. And that's another reason you need to vote. So that is it for this review. I hope you find it helpful for the midterm. Good luck, and we'll see you then.